Good afternoon. My name's Bokushu, and it's been a long time since I've been with you, really with you in the same place. Um, I was just realizing a little while ago that I have not touched or been touched by another human being in over 2 months. And I feel that probably there are quite a few of us who are in this situation. Around the time that I was last in your company, I was browsing in the basement laundry room library, and I came across this title, which I uh, picked up. And I was looking at it recently, and it doesn't have anything about wear a mask, wash your hands, stay the hell away from everyone. um, what a time we've had. Since our winter ongo ended with our urban session, we have seen over 1.4 million cases of COVID-19 in this country, and over 86,000 people have died of it, a quarter in this state of New York. And while this was going on, 36 million people lost their jobs. And I bring these numbers up not because you don't know them, but because we really have to take time to remember the people that we've lost, the tremendous pain that this epidemic is causing. And I particularly want to highlight the losses and sacrifices made by our healthcare providers, not only doctors and nurses, but people who are orderlies and clerks in hospitals, some of whom have lost their lives. People in supermarkets, meatpacking plants, drugstores, gas stations, you name it, the most unglamorous jobs that we all depend upon every day have turned into first responder roles with no appreciable increase in compensation for those dangers that those people are undergoing for us. And I just want to mention that because I don't think it can be too often remembered, the sacrifice that has been made and that is being made so that all of us can have this practice together now. So when I mentioned urban session, I didn't mention the topic of it. The topic, you may remember, was space. And what an interesting choice that was, given that we are now all confined to our spaces. So I think that although we did have a rich exploration of space, thanks to our wonderful Shuso Joran, who I saw earlier, she may still be around here, we really didn't quite probe deeply enough space. And as I look at the screen in front of me, I see all of you in your spaces. Together in one space, and yet all in separate spaces. So, what is space for you now? Is there room in this space for everything? What about the pain and suffering that's going on right now as we sit here today? It's worth mentioning, although everyone here knows it, that the Buddha taught the truth of suffering, the truth of its cause, the truth of its ending, and the path that leads to its ending, the path that leads to the end of suffering. And that is the path that we are on now, right now. This path is our path. And I do want to talk a little about the suffering, but I want to start by distinguishing pain and suffering from one another, because although the Buddha and many translations of his speeches or talks use the words seemingly interchangeably, I personally believe that they are quite distinct, and we need to keep track of them. So pain, in my proposal for this, is you're walking along the street and a piano falls out of a window and it hits you. Well, that's going to cause you pain. Quite a lot of pain, I imagine. But if you then glance up at the window from which the piano fell and you start to yell at the person and you go on and on and on about what an idiot they are and how careless they've been and how they should have known better than to drop that piano on your head like that. And are they insured? And so on. That's suffering. So the distinction, in my opinion, is pain is something that happens to us because something hits us. Literally or metaphorically, something hits us, or we hit something. And suffering is what we do with that. What we manufacture out of that, that is suffering. And I bring this up because before COVID-19 descended upon us, many of us were perhaps not entirely satisfied with our lives. And I'm just taking a guess, but I think many of us had things they were not entirely thrilled about in their lives. And sitting here now, a couple months later, I think most of us, I'll go out on a limb here and say that most of us would probably trade our current dissatisfaction for the one we had. Somehow the conditions that we were not so happy about 2 months ago, we are longing for now. And I think this is a really good illustration of how the suffering works. It's constantly a moving target based on causes and conditions and conditioning. So we were conditioned to believe that we could walk around with no mask or gloves. We could embrace other people. We could eat in restaurants. We could ride the subway. We could attend concerts and plays, and on and on and on. That was what we were conditioned to believe, and bang! Then we couldn't. Then we realized that it would transmit a fatal, possibly fatal disease, either from us or to us. So we really prefer the old suffering to the new suffering. But we don't get to make that choice, do we? We don't control the conditions that are surrounding us right now. We can only work with our response to those conditions, and that is our practice. That's the fuel for our practice, is working with our conditioning and the conditions that are prevailing around us as they evolve. So let me bring this home a little bit and talk about my own suffering. I suffer when I calculate that if the United States had handled COVID-19 like Germany, 55,000 people who were dead would be alive. And I just want to say that again to make sure you get it. That if you take the caseload rate and the death rate that Germany exhibits in this epidemic and apply it to this country's population, you end up with 55,000 fewer deaths now than what we really have. And that to me is an absolutely staggering indictment against our government and the way that people have conducted themselves in these times. And I really suffer because I don't know what to do with that. 55,000 people, it's beyond my comprehension. So this is a form of craving. That's what the Buddha called it, craving. Wanting things to be different than they are. And so the path is to work with this craving, and if I can come to terms with it, I won't suffer. If I can abandon my constant yearning for things to be different than they are, I won't suffer, or at least I'll suffer much less. So that's really easy to say and much, much harder to do. This is the practice, is to work with our own suffering, to see it and work with it, moment by moment, as we respond to causes and conditions like COVID-19. And this is an extremely hard practice right now. So the feelings that come up, of course, are very difficult. Sadness, isolation, feelings of powerlessness. Powerlessness and rage that this is how it is, that this is how it's being handled in our name and on our dime. And yet we have support from the oneness and spaciousness of reality, the unity of everything. We don't have to pull away and separate from what we cannot understand, what we cannot control, what we cannot tolerate. So let's take a little example of how we function in this oneness and how our suffering can be worked with. Let's say you need some flour. And as you may know, this is a particularly uncommon commodity right now, this very ordinary powder that we make bread and cookies from is almost unobtainable in some places. So you find that you don't have any more and you want some. And you go around from store to store to store, and finally you find a store where there happens to be, in the back of a shelf, miraculously several bags of flour. And you're a real baking fiend, you really like to bake. So your question at that point is, well, how many bags of flour am I going to buy? And of course, you're aware that there are other baking fiends out there besides yourself. The world is full suddenly of baking fiends. It's remarkable. So you have to really stop and ask yourself, well, I'm terrified that there will be no more fucking flour and that I will have none. There will be no bread, no cookies, or, God forbid, they will be store-bought and not even organic. But you have to stop and ask yourself, it is our practice to stop and to say, I am terrified that there will not be enough for me. I am terrified to the point where I would deprive many others of something that I myself am desperate to have. And there is no one who will appear at our shoulder, no voice that will whisper in our ear, you must buy this much flour and no more. We must make that judgment, moment to moment, whatever the flower might take the form of, wherever we might find ourselves, we must constantly make that judgment. Dogen expresses something that I think is relevant to this, much more eloquently than I could. You allow the cause and effect of wholesome and unwholesome actions to practice. It is not that you put cause and effect into action, or that you create cause and effect, but cause and effect allow you to practice. And the first line to me is really amazing. He says, you allow the cause and effect of wholesome and unwholesome actions to practice. Wholesome and unwholesome actions are practicing. Reality is expressing itself through us and through our actions. Supreme, unsurpassable enlightenment is to see that you want to buy all the flour and to refrain from buying all the flour. Supreme, unsurpassable enlightenment is to see that you do not want to wear a mask and to refrain from not wearing a mask. Supreme, unsurpassable enlightenment is to walk by a couple who are not wearing masks and to refrain from glaring at this couple who is not wearing masks. In all of these cases, supreme, unsurpassable enlightenment is refraining from what I want to do. I am refraining from my addiction to myself. I am declining to enact that very seductive and potent addiction. And that addiction tells me that I want to suffer, to separate from the reality of my connection to everything. I can refrain from that. Perhaps you've seen stories in the news of armed protesters clustering around state capitol buildings and even going into them without masks, without any social distancing, to protest masks, to protest social distancing. And this they do in the name of something they call freedom. But I would like to respectfully say that this is not freedom. This is the opposite of freedom, the very opposite of what they claim to be working for, fighting for. They are enslaved, not free, enslaved to themselves. And they want to bury themselves deeper still in the pit of what they call themselves. And I can really relate. I can really relate to wanting to bury myself more deeply in the pit of what I call myself. I too feel the allure of wanting to be more and more enslaved to myself, to my fixed ideas of how things ought to be and how I fit into those things. I'm no better, if such a thing could even be conceived of. I'm no better than the protesters, and they're no worse than I am. I don't raise them to put them down. and I don't raise them to hold them up. But there is a distinction, and this is the critical point, is that I have practiced realization that points emphatically to the equality of all things. I have refrained from unwholesome action, an ethical framework that manifests as a bag of flour left on a grocery shelf, that manifests as me staying in this apartment most of the time. Krishnamurti wrote, freedom is not a reaction. Freedom is not a choice. It is man's pretense that because he has choice, he is free. Freedom is pure observation without direction, without fear of punishment or reward. In observation, one begins to discover the lack of freedom. Freedom is found in the choiceless awareness of our daily existence and activity. What a perfect expression of practice. The choiceless awareness of our daily existence and activity. Of course, though, to function, we do make choices. And that's the juicy part, is that we understand that pure observation is freedom. And we have to find it in the muck of everyday life, in the grocery store aisles, in the streets, in the ambulances and hospitals. And God knows whatever else awaits us as this society and its relationship to COVID-19 evolves. It is continuous practice realization that awaits us. Living with our eyes open, with our hearts open, there is only this practice realization with COVID-19. I mentioned our urban session a little while ago, and of course our winter ongo, and we had a wonderful study text, which many of you know, but I'll just show the cover. So you can put them together, right? You can enjoy both titles if you can find this one. I think it's a little out of date. And in this book, which is a collection of koans with verse commentaries by 3 women Zen masters, I chose a verse to end with. This is from Case 20, Jiashan's Awakening, and this particular verse was written by Chan Master Zukui, and she writes, alone he has floated his orchid boat for 30 springtimes. The misty waves fish dry, the golden-scaled fish caught. Then he secluded himself, leaving no tracks. Who knows where? The reed flowers under the bright moon. The grief can kill you. How true. Now, as it was centuries ago, the grief can kill you. And this too is practice realization. We can practice with our grief, with our loneliness, with our longing, our fear, our rage at what's been done and what will come as this process unfolds, as this epidemic runs its course, day by day, minute by minute. The grief can kill you and give you life. Thank you.